I was 13 when the social worker drove me through the winding mountain roads to Blackwood Academy. The accident had taken my parents 3 months earlier, and my elderly aunt could no longer manage my care. The school emerged from the mist like something from another century. Gray stone walls, narrow windows, and a bell tower that pierced the low-hanging clouds. My roommates were Danny, a freckled boy from the coast, and Luke, whose nervous laugh echoed through our cramped room at odd hours. The room smelled of old wood and industrial soap, with 3 narrow beds lined against the wall. A single window faced the courtyard, where ancient oaks cast twisted shadows across the grounds. It was Luke who first told me about the window rule. "Never open it after sunset," he whispered on my second night, catching me reaching for the latch. "Not ever." Danny nodded gravely from his bed. "Last year, a kid in room 12 left his window cracked. They found him the next morning, face blue, tongue hanging out. Looked like he'd been strangled, but there were no marks on his throat." The story they told went back decades. A woman named Margaret Holloway had lived in the house that once stood where our dormitory now sat. Her husband died in the war, leaving her alone with grief that slowly consumed her sanity. One winter night, she walked into the lake behind the school and never came out. They found her body weeks later, frozen beneath the ice. But Margaret's death hadn't ended her suffering. Students claim she wandered the grounds after dark, drawn to windows like a moth to flame. She would press her waterlogged face against the glass, searching for a way inside, for someone to join her in the cold depths of the lake. It's just stories, I told myself, but every night I checked the window latch twice before bed. The weeks passed quietly until the incident with Tommy Morrison. I woke to screaming from down the hall. Tommy sat on his bed, shaking and pointing at the window. Muddy handprints streaked the glass from outside, long, thin fingers that had clawed at the pane. The groundskeeper found wet footprints leading from the lake to our building, but no explanation for how they got there. Tommy was transferred to a different school the next day. Curiosity gnawed at me like a physical ache. Every rational part of my mind dismissed the stories as superstition, but something deeper, some primal instinct, whispered warnings whenever I looked toward that window after dark. Two weeks before Halloween, I made my decision. Danny and Luke had gone to study hall, leaving me alone in the room. The autumn air was crisp, almost inviting. I approached the window, my hand trembling as I reached for the latch. The metal was cold against my palm. The window opened with a soft creak. At first, nothing happened. Cool air drifted in, carrying the scent of dead leaves and stagnant water. I sat on my bed, watching the darkness beyond the glass. Minutes passed. My eyelids grew heavy. I must have dozed, because I woke to the sound of dripping. The room was freezing. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost had begun forming on the inside of the window frame. But the window was still open, still inviting whatever waited in the darkness outside. That's when I heard it, a wet, sliding sound against the exterior wall. My heart hammered as I forced myself to look toward the window. At first, I saw only darkness. Then, slowly, a pale shape began to emerge from below the sill. Fingers appeared first, white and bloated, with fingernails black as coal. They gripped the window frame with unnatural strength, followed by thin wrists and arms that seemed too long for any human body. The smell hit me then. Lake water and decay, so strong it made me gag. Margaret's face rose into view. Her skin looked translucent, like something that had spent too long underwater. Dark hair clung to her scalp in sodden strands, and her eyes... God, her eyes were completely black, like holes burned into her skull. But it was her mouth that froze my blood. It hung open, impossibly wide, revealing not teeth, but a yawning darkness that seemed to stretch back into her throat forever. She stared directly at me. I tried to scream, tried to move, but terror had paralyzed every muscle. Margaret began pulling herself through the window frame, her body contorting in ways that defied anatomy. Her limbs bent at wrong angles as she squeezed through the opening, water streaming from her clothes onto the floor. A warm hand touched my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see Danny or Luke, but the room was empty except for shadows. Yet I felt the presence beside me, familiar and comforting, like my mother's touch when I was sick. The scent of her perfume, faint but unmistakable, cut through the stench of lake water. When I turned back to the window, Margaret had frozen halfway through, her black eyes fixed on the empty space beside me, and for the first time her expression changed. Fear replaced hunger. She began pulling herself backward, retreating from whatever she saw or sensed in the room with me. Within seconds, she had vanished into the darkness. I slammed the window shut and stumbled to the light switch. The room blazed with fluorescent brightness, revealing only wet marks on the floor where Margaret had begun to enter. The smell of decay lingered, mixed with something else, something warm and protective that I couldn't name. Danny and Luke found me sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the window. "What happened?" Danny asked. but I couldn't find words to explain. I finished my final year at Blackwood Academy, but I never opened that window again. Sometimes, on moonless nights, I would hear soft scratching at the glass, patient, persistent, waiting. But I also felt that other presence, the one that had saved me, standing guard in the darkness. The strange thing is, I never told anyone about my mother's spirit protecting me that night. I never mentioned her perfume or her touch. Because my mother was still alive, living in California with her new husband. I have no idea what saved me in that room or why it chose to wear my mother's memory like a mask. But sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I wonder if Margaret wasn't the only ghost that found me that night. And I wonder what it wants in return.